What is up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Limited Resources. This episode number 419. My name is Marshall. I'm one of your Limited Resources. And joining me on the line, it's Luis Scott-Vargas. Luis, how goes, sir? How's your week?
Good. Things are going well, and I'm excited for the holiday cube, for the powered cube coming back next week.
Oh, yeah.
It is, I think, literally my most enjoyable way to play Magic outside of actually a match on the Pro Tour, which you don't get very many of those a year. So the holiday cube is really why I play Magic. You've
been vintage mastering at all?
Yeah, I've done a couple of those. It's fun. Vintage Masters is good. I would recommend you try it if you're into that sort of thing. But the holiday cube that's where I know where my bread is buttered, and it is in the holiday cube.
Yes, and of course we'll be playing a bunch of that once it comes out. And yeah, I think Vintage Masters is pretty cool too. This week on the show, we have lined up for you a Q&A. That's right. It's kind of a mailbag type thing from our patrons. This one is going to be about common mistakes, different types of mistakes, different ways to remedy those mistakes. And we got some fantastic questions from our patrons. Thank you for that. Before we get into the questions themselves, I want to mention our sponsor, channelfireball.com. That's the place to go for everything you need Magic related on the internet. And while you're there, you can check out a bunch of the awesome free content as well. I noticed, Luis, that you're just about done with your unstable limited set reviews finally.
Yes, I reviewed against my better judgment every card for both gameplay and flavor. So
you are insane. What were you thinking?
Look, all I'm saying is when a set comes out, I review it. And maybe I should have broken that pattern, but no. Unstable's a lot of fun. I'm actually going to do an unstable draft this weekend, and I'm looking forward to it.
Make sure you have a judge on hand.
Luckily, there will be some judges in attendance, so I think that'll work. But
you're lucky.
I think kind of like what you said when you tweeted about it, it was like, it's a really fun thing to do once, and you're probably not in the market to do a whole lot more than that. I suspect I'll land there.
Yeah, that's kind of where I ended up landing on it. It was cool. I had I animated my library.
Yes, that's the thing, is there's a lot of cards like Animate Library that have just insanely good flavor. So
yeah, super fun.
That's kind of the point.
Yeah, but like you said, I'm definitely not. I don't want to draft it again. Like, it was so complicated. I just felt overwhelmed. So anyway, but it was definitely an experience. So yeah, you can check out Luis's review on Channel Fireball. While you're there, you can buy Unstable. Get some of those sweet basic lands and the tokens, and maybe even like an Urza or something like that. You can pick that up at Channel Fireball right now. And while you're there, you can check out. Sorry, say again. Yeah.
I wanted to mention that we're revamping our newsletter. I'm actually writing the newsletter every week. So if you want access
could you take on any more stuff? My God, man. You're a crazy person.
The newsletter is going to have the kind of the deck I played that week. And so this week I wrote about As Foretold Living End, a really, really sweet new modern deck. Mm-hmm. And so each week it's going to have a little bit more content, because like you said, I haven't really been producing enough. So if you sign up for a newsletter, you get access to more exclusive content and some sweet stuff like that.
Okay. How do they do that?
If you just go to the website, there are links to sign up for the newsletter.
Okay, cool. And I'll try to find one and put it in the show notes as well. Also, of course, we want to thank you, especially this week, our patrons, the people who support the show via Patreon. You really help, keep the show going and let us do what we want to do with the show without having to have restriction. And, Patreon kind of screwed up, and they changed the way that they charged, especially affecting people who pledged a relatively small amount. And as it turns out, that makes up a lot of people. A lot of the people that support LR, they do it like $1, right? And that's totally fine. Like that adds up. That's very real for us on our end. Yet they were being punished for that. And thankfully, Patreon has decided to roll back those changes and reassess things, which is what I was hoping that they would do. And that means that we're back to normal on the Patreon. And I am relieved that was a bit of a stressful week because, we lost a bunch of patrons. We also gained a bunch. Thank you so much for everybody that joined, even though Patreon was kind of going through its little mistake there. But again, they have rolled that back. So thankfully, we can just stick where we're at and everything. Don't have to make any major changes. So if you're interested in that, it's patreon.com/limited resources. It's got everything there about how it works. Easy to get set up. And you do support the show when you do so.
I had to cancel my pledge because of the changes.
Yeah, you tweeted that.
And I really don't think that, I have it in me to come back. So it's an unfortunate but slightly missed opportunity.
Luis, like I always say, look, if you want to help support the show, we're here and we really appreciate it. But if it's not in the cards for you at the moment, we totally understand that too, Luis. So no problem. You're forgiven. So we're not going to do any specific Crack-A-Pack this week, but I did get given a couple of these like last season buy a box things. And I figured, you know what I would do? I'm going to put them in with the giveaway. We're going to do the giveaway next week. I've got a bunch of rares from our Crack-A-Packs ready to get given away, and we're going to put whatever I pull in this pack. It's just a couple of extra cards that they give you. All right, so we got a Panharmonicon. That's a fun one. A foil Grasp of Darkness. All right, well, that's not standard anymore. And a Brain in a Jar. All right, so perhaps not the best pack ever, but no worries. I got another one.
Which reminds me of opening treasure chests on Magic.
This is exactly what that is. And by the way, I have
3 card packs, and you will get Spore Frogs in them.
Yes, and I have no guilt at doing this, by the way, because these are not draftable. All right, our next one, Fleet Wheel Cruiser. Yeah. Prakata Pillar Bug in foil, and our other rare is a Brood Butcher. So,
look, before you mock the Fleet Wheel Cruiser, if you turned on the finals of the Vintage World Championships last year, there was a Fleet Wheel Cruiser in play.
That is absurd. That is absurd. All right, so it's the best card in Vintage. So there you go. That's going to get sent out. And you know what else I'm going to do? I'm going to ship, let's see. Yeah, I'm just going to give all the rares and tokens I got out of my what's it called, draft. And then I also had a few extra packs of Unstable given to me as well. And so I'm just going to throw that in there too. So you're going to get, I don't know, Urza Academy Headmaster, a bunch of random tokens. X, that card was fun. Dragon token's pretty sweet.
X did seem fun for one of the players in the game, yeah.
Yes, yeah, my opponents were less enthused. I got an Earl of Squirrel, Luis. So anyway, I'm throwing all that in here too. And there we go. I'm going to be picking a winner for that next week. Okay, so that's it. Let's get into our questions. We've got a ton of awesome questions. And again, these questions come from our patrons. This is one of the bonuses that you get for supporting the show, is that you get access to the Patreon feed, which is where I post things like, hey, we're having a special guest this week. What questions do you want? Or the Patreon question of the week that we do every week, or feedback about the show as well. And then things like this, which is where when we do our Q&A shows, that we decided a few months ago, Luis, was like something we really needed to hit on more, because we have this great resource with the patrons, and they just ask such awesome questions. And it can be hard for us to, what have we not talked about recently? And what are the things we want to make sure we keep hammering on? And this is a way to tap right into our core audience and get that information. And so
what we try to do also is answer questions that are not, overly specific. So if you have a really specific question, we're going to look for things that apply to like a broad swath of the people, listening to the show. Yeah. And it's a really good way to kind of get that information, because we don't know what you don't know.
Exactly.
But you know a lot of things, and some of them are even useful. So we're going to, try and divulge as much as we can there.
All right. Let's see how many we hit here. All right. So first question comes from, Weston Whitlock, who says, Weston says, hello, Marshall and OSV. I was hoping you could talk about the benefits of keeping track of yours and your opponent's life totals with a pen and paper instead of a dice. Thanks so much.
This is a open and shut case here, I believe.
Yes, very much so.
Dice can get knocked over. Dice, can be error prone. Sometimes you have a 6 and it looks like a 9. Don't use dice. You can use dice to decide who goes first. You can use dice to keep counters on your Arcbound Ravager. Do not use dice to keep track of your life total. Also, dice don't keep a history. When you have a life total dispute, which does happen, I mean, I've had them. Every single player who plays a lot of matches has had them. Looking back and seeing like, okay, you went from 20 to 18, 18 to 15, 15 to 11 is much more illuminating, and you'll be able to construct what happened. Then my dice says you're at 8 and you think you're at 9.
Yep. Especially imagine if both players were using dice.
Well, imagine if you were using dice and your opponent had this history.
Yeah, there you go.
Guess who the judge is going to believe? They're going to believe the person who can put together this cohesive story about a game state. And I'm not saying your opponent's lying about it, but your opponent is going to be able to say like, look, I took a hit from your 2/2, and then I hit for your 2/2/2s, and then I took 3 off my spell, and you're like, yeah, but I think you're at 7, and that doesn't line up, but I don't know what happened.
Right.
Well,
yep.
I can tell you how that's going to go because I've seen that. So yes, you use pen and paper. It also lets you see both you and your opponent very easily and at a glance. And even afterwards, after a game, after the match, you can kind of see what happened if you're so inclined. So
yeah. couple alternatives too. You could use your phone as long as it's not at, high level play, because you're not allowed to use electronic devices like that. But one of the things that people have been using, I don't know if you've seen these around, Luis,
but those little pads, right?
Yeah, those they're called boogie boards. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's basically an Etch-a-Sketch with a pen.
Yeah, it is. And you can write down your life totals. You hit one button and it just clears the screen. And that way you don't, the paper aspect, you're not wasting a bunch of paper. So, and I think that that's just as good as paper.
I do my part for the environment by not carrying around paper.
So yeah, by stealing it from somebody else. Next question comes from Kyle Wells. It says, hi guys, I find that I usually play too aggressively, always wanting to play cards, attack, and activate abilities probably before I should. I'm always afraid that if I don't beat face early, then my opponent will overwhelm me. But obviously that just forces me to run out of gas early. How do you stay patient and not panic? This is a great question, and it's one that I see from a lot of beginner players and even intermediate players where, once they kind of get a feel for the rules, they'll start deploying stuff, right? They're like, well, I know what I can do now and I'm going to do it. And, there's a creature, I'm going to use my removal spell on it. There's an attack available, I'm going to attack with all my things. And it is really interesting to watch as people transition away from that and start to look at things in a bit more of a patient light, because this is a default that a lot of people find themselves in, especially players of a certain archetype, more aggressive, minded players tend to do this. And this is a way to lose a lot of equity. I think we've all been on the other side of this, right? Where, you've got a couple of creatures out and your, opponent's like attack with all these things. And you're like, wow, that's really aggressive. Well, I guess I just have to block here, block. They're like, okay, cool. You take 4 and I lose my 2 creatures. And you're like, really? Like you just ran your creature, or you play some random 2/2 that doesn't matter on the board at all. Like it doesn't even have a profitable block. And they're like, lightning bolt that. And you, okay, sure. And it goes away. But, later on down the line, your stuff gets to stay alive. And this is something that I've seen many, many times. So the question he wants to know is, how do you stay patient? How do you get yourself out of that mentality? And the way I would do it, and this is going to come up a few times for a few of the other questions that are similar, but a little bit different, which is to take stock more often, right? One of the things that I think people do a lot is they get a certain play style in their mind and they can't let go of it. For example, I curve out 2-drop, 3-drop. I have a combat trick. I'm hitting you, right? And I've got you down to 11 and you haven't really done much. And then you cast a 5-mana 4/4 that, blanks my 2 or 3 creatures on board. I don't have anything else I can do at this point. You'll see that player sit there and they want to keep attacking because they have been, and they're kind of like, they want to go for the throat. But if they really just took a snapshot, like literally, like what if it was just a photo of this board state with the hand information of that player and said, what would you do here? Like, well, I can't attack. I don't have any combat tricks. I don't have a removal spell, and they have a 4/4 blocker. Like, I'm just going to lose my creature. Yet when you're in that moment, you feel this urge to get in there and attack. And I think the way to combat it is to take a little bit of a timeout. Honestly, every turn's not the worst idea. I see a lot of people do this during their draw step. They'll take the card off the top of their library. They'll have it set down in front of them without having looked at it. And then I'll just see them just scan the board real quick and just go, okay, where am I at? Where am I the aggressor? Am I ahead? Am I behind? Am I going to be looking to attack this turn? And then they'll look at their card and kind of reassess after that. I think that that's like a pretty good habit to get into, where you don't have to like go through every single option every time, but just taking stock of what's actually happening is a really useful skill.
So I think that is definitely part of it. And you are right in that people tend to carry their game plan forward even when it's past the point where they should. Mm-hmm. The other thing you actually hinted at, and when you're reading out the question, which is, a lot of these players feel uncomfortable when they're not playing aggressive decks. And without presuming too much, I think that there is a chance that Kyle is kind of saying this, where I always feel like I should be the aggressor. I always feel like I should be the one attacking and going for the throat. And what scares you when you're in that mindset, and I know because I went through it too, because it's kind of like the natural life cycle of learning, right? Mm-hmm. Is you don't understand inevitability, except that that you always feel that your opponent has it. You always feel like if the game goes too long, my opponent's going to win. I got to end the game.
Yeah.
And one of the huge level ups in draft or Magic in general is learning how to capture inevitability and how to end up in a spot where you are the person with inevitability and how to play towards that. Because when you draft I don't know why you're drafting Ixalan, but if you did, you could draft the dinosaur control deck with, multiple Savage Stomps and a Fiery Cannonade and a good curve. and Gishath's son's avatar or Thundering Spineback, and you're winning the late game, you don't have to race. You actually are in a position where you're trying to kill all your opponent's stuff and then win with a 7-drop. This is the kind of deck that does not want to attack with their 3/2 when their opponent has a 2/2 out, because you don't want to trade your 3 for their 2, even though that looks advantageous. And learning how to draft these decks is really, really important. Once you start drafting those decks, you have to adjust your mindset. And that's part of the skill of it, and that's part of the challenge of it, is that knowing that when you can win the long game, you don't have to play this like very, fast, aggressive strategy. So I guess what I would recommend is kind of identify what deck you're in and play towards that deck. If you're playing a control deck, just try to adjust the mindset. Like, the longer that I survive, the longer the game goes, the more I'm going to win.
Yeah.
If you're playing an aggressive deck, then this is the right mindset. You do have to be aggressive. But it's a surefire way to lose if you're playing a control deck by playing too aggressively.
Yeah. And, this does take a bit of bravery, right? Because when you start getting into that mid-range to control type decks, you do have a lot more options. You do need to pay closer attention. You need to know when to switch gears, when you're the aggressor, when they are. Where with the aggressive decks, it's very one-minded, and it's very easy to just take the responsibility off of yourself and say, well, I had a good start, but I'm an aggro deck. It didn't work out next game, and I think that, when you're ready, you step forward and you start playing, more in the middle, in the mid-range and the control.
Yeah, basically, you want to get out of the mindset of feeling like the late game is your enemy, and feeling this tension of like, I got to get this done. I got to get
your
this
friend.
done. Because look, I know what it's like to play those decks. When you have the all 2-drop deck, you do feel that way. But what Kyle's describing is feeling that way in every game of Magic, and you really have to recalibrate and reset that, because all these games are different, and your decks are going to be different, and you're just not always going to be in that spot.
Yeah, and you shouldn't be. It's more fun to do the other ones, and you also win more. All right, this next one, Luis, I'm going to throw you a few questions. These all fell under the umbrella of mulligans. Okay, so I'm going to just toss these, and then we'll have a mulligan discussion. Okay, so Dustin says, hey, Marshall and Luis, I often find myself having issues with mulligans, either throwing away a keepable hand or keeping a marginal one. Is there a way to more intuitively know when to keep and when to throw back a hand, perhaps a short checklist of things that a hand needs in order to be keepable? Love the show. Thanks for all you do. Ben says, hey, Marshall and Luis, I find I make the most mistakes when choosing whether to keep or mulligan. I've heard pros like Reed Duke, who take a long time considering each hand, say things like, well, this is in the bottom 50% of hands, but surely keepable, or how good is this hand if I draw a mountain? Is there a short list of questions I should ask myself in determining whether to keep or mulligan? And how bad does a hand have to be before you mulligan to 6 or even to 5? And then Daniel Schneider says, I used to never mulligan because I hated going to 6 and maybe getting color or land screwed. Then I learned I should mulligan more. I heard the idea that you should mulligan hands if you just need to hit a land and your hand is good. But then I started watching streams and coverage and noticed players keeping hands that I thought were textbook mulligans. 3 island, 4 white card, or 1 land with a 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, or 4 lands, 3 lands and 4 drops. Is this a good rule of thumb? So you can see that there's a thread through all 3 of these questions, which are people want rules of thumb. They want a short checklist of ideas.
Yeah.
So give it to them.
Mulligan heuristics are pretty complicated.
Yes.
Because Magic, it sounds like a cop-out, but everything's contextual, because it is. Magic's very complicated. That's why we love the game. That said, there are some easy heuristics, some easy rules of thumb. The one that I think is the most important to remember is don't keep hands that need 2 things. So a hand that needs to hit a forest is very different than a hand that needs to hit a forest and, like, say, a 2-drop or a 3-drop.
Yep.
A hand that, like, some 1-land hands are keepable, some aren't. But if you want trying to keep a 1-land hand that needs to not only hit a land but also doesn't have early plays, like, that hand is obviously a mulligan. Or a hand that has, like, 3 forests and 4 white cards, but the white cards are like auras and you need a creature to put them on.
Right.
These are hands that are pretty far from being keepable. It doesn't mean you necessarily keep hands that only need 1 thing, but that's the first thing, is if you need 2 things to go right, like, that is very different. Like, if you need to draw not only a land but a swamp, that's really different. Like, keeping a hand of mountain 6 great black cards, that's so different than keeping a hand of swamp 6 great black cards, because sometimes that is something you should do.
Right.
The other thing is to kind of know the format. The format is a little more important than most things. And like, there are some formats, like we just had Iconic Masters. How many times, Marshall, did you keep a hand in Iconic Masters that didn't have a play till like turn 3 or turn 4?
No, more than I would in a normal format.
Right. Like you didn't disqualify them.
No.
But if you're on the draw in Ixalan and your first play is a 3-drop, you're already like, I can't do this. And if your first play is a 4-drop, you don't even think about it.
Right.
And that's knowing the format. If you're playing a constructed deck, to stray a little bit from limited, if you're playing constructed deck and you don't have an early play on like turns like 2 and 3, there's basically no constructed format where you can't do anything until turn 3.
No, you're just shipping that. Yeah.
So you need to know the format. You need to know what the critical turn is to do something. And if your hand is very far from that, like 4 land, 2 4-drops, and a 5-drop is generally not keepable in limited unless, here's where the context comes in, unless you have like a sweeper or something extraordinary, not just normal limited cards. And the last thing is knowing what your deck is. You can't mulligan to a 2-drop in a deck with 2 2-drops.
Right.
You drafted a deck with 2 2-drops. You're here now. You don't get a chance to decide, oh man, I don't have a 2-drop, I should mulligan. Because there's some limited decks where you're like, I'm on the draw and I don't have a 2-drop. Yeah, I'm going to mulligan this. My deck has 7 2-drops. You have 2 2-drops, you don't have that luxury. And knowing kind of what your deck's trying to accomplish is also important because some decks mulligan better than others. A deck with a very low curve tends to mulligan better than a deck with a higher curve because it needs fewer resources to enact its game plan.
Yeah, and that's a key, by the way. Like that's one of the hidden benefits that you get from drafting a good deck, right? We talk about, you want to have a good mana curve, right? You want to have a lot of 2s and 3s and fewer 4s, 5s, and 6s, maybe a 1 or not. And, we talk about that as being good, right? But one of the tangible ways that you benefit from that is that you mulligan less frequently. And when you do mulligan, you're more likely to be able to cast some spells that game, right? And actually, play a game of Magic if you have a deck with a good curve, especially of creatures. And that's one of those things that I think kind of slips, between the cracks because it's hard to make that connection between when you build the deck and then making a mulligan decision because you're just viewing it at face value. But it actually influences that pretty strongly.
Yeah, and you have to keep in mind that these are all the contexts that you have available always, right? You always know what the format is and what your deck is. You don't always know what your opponent's deck is, but in post-board games, you actually get to use that information as well. And sometimes they're not going to play something until turn 3 or 4. They're playing a control deck. Then you can be a little more relaxed on keeping a slow hand. Mm-hmm. Likewise, what if they have inevitability? Then all of a sudden, you're much more willing to mulligan aggressively to a 2-drop. So mulligan's complicated. It's a hard part of anyone's game. Like if you watch my last couple of videos, I've lost a lot of games off keeping hands that I probably shouldn't have. Mm-hmm. I can be pretty loose with that sometimes because it's so hard to want to mulligan, right? You never want to ship back a handful of good cards.
No, the fear is always the fear isn't the 6-card hand you're going to draw, right? It's not like
it's always
yeah. It's that I don't want to have to mulligan my 6-card hand because. And by the way, we should touch on this because one of the questions in this was specifically asking about this is from Ben who said. How bad does it have to be before you mulligan to 6 or even down to 5? And there are significant drop-offs, between 7 and 6, and especially 6 and 5 as far as like win percentage goes.
There are, but I don't think that's a useful way to look at it because I don't think we are equipped, especially in the middle of a match, to really put those numbers together in a meaningful way.
Well, but I mean, it influences you, right? Like. What we're really trying to do here is combine a whole bunch of numerical factors that we don't have the actual numbers on, right? Like, so for example, if I sit down against you in a limited match in, format X, whatever it is, and I understand the format, I'm saying, okay, let's pile on all these factors, right? First one, am I on the play or the draw? Okay, that's that. Second one, you were mentioned knowing the format. And to me, that means saying, what is a reasonable expectation that my opponent could do here? Right? Are they going to go 2, 3, 4 with some combat tricks, or are we going to be sitting here and not casting anything of real relevance until turns 5, 6, and 7? Right? I need to know that stuff too. And then I look at the cards in my opening hand and I have to start factoring in, well, what is my deck doing? And what does this hand do? right? Because obviously we're making a decision off of this snapshot of 7 cards and saying, well, what does this hand do? But it's really not that. It's this hand plus the top, say, 3 to 4 cards of our library. That's what we really are trying to decide, what we're going to keep. So what do the top 3 to 4 cards of our library look like? Well, on average, right? And this is an approximation, we will find X number of lands out of that, depending on if we're running 16, 17, 18 lands. And then what does our mana curve look like? Well, we have, 5 2-drops we can draw out of the first 3 cards or, whatever. These are all starting to pile up in our head and they're all nudging us in some direction. And I think that this one has to be one of those factors, right? Where it's like, well, the percentage on going from 6 to 5 is a lot worse. So I don't, I'd rather just keep this, sketchier 6.
Yeah. My only caution with that is that it's hard to do that kind of calculation on the fly, and people tend to estimate numbers incorrectly.
Oh yeah.
Like when Reed says this hand's in the bottom 50%, like maybe Reed can do that and figure it out well. I would say most people are going to be like, what percentile is this hand? And they're just going to give you a number that they pull out of that they don't know.
Yeah. And also, we have to note that Reed was that's pretty vague, right? Yeah. Like he's saying like it's a top half or bottom half. That's about the least specific you can get. Right? Like, he's not like, oh, it's in the 80th percentile. It's just like, it's slightly worse.
The numbers I think that you want to know about is like the odds of hitting a land, like know how many of each source you have. Like if you need to hit a forest by turn 4,
yep.
Like it's important to know how many forests in your deck and kind of like the rough numbers on that, or hitting a land by turn 3, or like, this is something that comes up in formats with cycling. And I've just recently seen it in Constructed playing Death Shadow, where you have a very land-light deck, but you have like cycling cards like Street Wraith, which cycle for no mana, and cantrips like Opt. To if you were playing, let's say, Amonkhet and had a bunch of cyclers, like do you keep Swamp 2 or the Broken Lands on the draw with a good 2-drop? And it's like, yeah, I probably would keep that. You're seeing your draw step. You're seeing your next draw step to hit before you miss your second land, plus 2 cycles. You're seeing 4 cards, and you need to hit 1 land. And assuming you're playing like 16 to 18 lands, you're a heavy favorite to see that. So I think it's important to kind of know those things, but don't stress too much about trying to figure out exactly where your hand falls or what your expected win percentage is with a hand. You just don't have that information.
No, but you mentioned just a minute ago about being able to figure out like the lands thing. Like that is a basic, like we have the hypergeometric calculator for that, and I'll put a link to it in the show notes. But you can run those numbers when you're not at the table, and some of the things that will pop out to you are the differences between something that you touched on very briefly there, Luis, which was I need to draw a forest before say turn, I have 3 draw steps to draw a forest versus I need to draw a land before then. There is a huge difference between those percentage wise. If you've got 8 forests, it might be, 57, 58%, but if it's any land in your deck and you've already drawn, say 3 of them, and you've got 3 draw steps at it, you're in the 80%, to hit a land by the 3rd turn. And so now, knowing that is valuable information, right? I mean, that's helpful stuff.
Yeah. And if you know that, like how often do you miss, like, yeah, it's 87% to hit 1 land with 16 left in your deck when looking at 3 cards.
Right.
So yeah, the 87% is high, but here's the rub. That doesn't mean you're 87% to win that game. It just means you're 87% to hit a land.
Yes.
And that's why you can't keep a hand that needs 2 things to go right. Because once you start adding the conditional probability of hitting a land and it's a forest, or hitting a land plus a 2-drop, then it's like this hand looks a lot less appealing.
Yeah, that's a great point. And this is, I think, strengthens your point earlier about, okay, so we've got all these numbers, but applying them is very difficult. And we often don't have the numbers.
Look, if it was easy and you could just calculate it, Magic would be a lot less fun.
I agree.
So I think one closing thought on this is I think that the faster the limited format is, the more forgiving it is to mulligan. You should mulligan more often because it matters more that you play something on turn 2 and you need fewer cards to win the game. The slower a format is, the more time you have to draw out of it, and the more powerful your more expensive cards are, the less likely I am to want to mulligan.
Good. All right. There's more. Yeah. Anyway, Rob Cruz also had a mulligan question, but I think we've hit it here. He's talking about the decision trees around mulligans, but I think that's kind of what we were just getting into. So let's go to our next one from Michael definitely not attempting that last name. Thank you so much for the show. Having a source for limited specific has helped me with my drafts greatly. Awesome. My question, how do I identify what's that?
Oh, no, Kiewitz?
I'm in.
I
sure.
don't know.
I support you. My question is, how do I identify a true mistake versus a correct play that didn't work?
Great question.
Yeah. After many of my games, I look back and believe that I played correctly. But to my outs, when can I say that it was correct play and I got unlucky, or if I should have done something else? Thanks for making me a better Magic player. Welcome, Michael. So what a great question.
There's a lot to dive in here. The first thing is what we're trying to identify here is, don't be rowdy. Don't be results oriented. And as with every time we bring up this topic, it's really hard to fight that, because as human beings, we're conditioned to be like, do the thing, see how the thing ended up, and then judge whether it was a good idea based on how the results.
Yeah, I mean, that's almost the baseline for like what you'd think a smart thinking person would do, right? Like that makes sense, yet it can really trick you.
But what we're trying to do here is, in a lot of these cases, we have enough information to know that what our play is correct or not correct without knowing what the result is. For example, if you have a lightning bolt, a deal 3 in your hand, right? Mm-hmm. And your opponent is at 6 life, but they're attacking you with a 5/3 and you're at 6 life. So you can either go to 1 or hold the lightning bolt, hoping to draw your one other lightning bolt, or you can bolt their 5/3 and hope to draw any number of other cards that would be relevant in the game. Let's say you have way more ways to come back if you don't try to go for a lightning bolt to their face. If you just kill their 5/3 and try to play a longer game, and you do that, but then you draw the other lightning bolt, you can say like, wow, I made a mistake there, but I don't think that's necessarily right.
Yeah, it's not necessarily
It really
true.
just depends on everything else that's going on. It's like if you had to decide which of your creatures to sacrifice, and you sacrifice the smaller one, and then they played a card that kills a big creature that you didn't know they had in their deck. Like, there's no way that it would have been right to do that. Right. So what we're trying to do here is give you the framework to make the best decisions, keep track of the results. You care about what happens because maybe you were wrong, but it is really, really important to try and make the right decision and divorce that from the results of the process. The part where this question breaks down for me is when it's asked Michael's like, when can I say it was correct, or when can I say I got unlucky? It's like, ooh, I see that, and I'm like, if that's not actually a great way to think about it. Your goal is not to know when you are right to complain. So maybe that's just phrasing. But when I see that, it does kind of, activate my spider sense. Like, you want to figure out when you're unlucky. Well, that's not an attitude I would recommend. I think what's really important is trying to figure out what you could have done differently in a particular game, and whether or not you want, win or lose. And I think that all you can do really is try to figure out why you're making a decision. And sometimes it's as easy as number of outs, right? Sometimes it's as easy as like, well, if I do this line of play, I have 4 cards that win me the game. And if I do this line of play, I have 3 cards that win me the game. Even if I draw one of those 3 cards, I'm still supposed to go for the higher chances of winning.
Right.
And if you get unlucky, you get unlucky. And sure, it's fine to like acknowledge that and, be annoyed or whatever. But the amount of value you get off of trying to figure out what you could have done differently that would have given yourself a higher chance to gain is way better than just saying like, well, I got unlucky and moving on.
Yeah. It's important not to, it's important to, because like my instinct at this point is to fact check myself, for lack of a better term. For example, let's say I do keep the bigger creature in the scenario that you gave, and then my opponent says, okay, Legion's Judgment, kill that. I'll ask myself, was there a reasonable reason why I should have considered that? For example, let's say that I had seen 2 copies of Legion's Judgment in a prior game, and let's say that the creature that I decided to sacrifice was lethal, right? Like both creatures were lethal. And I just said, well, I'll just keep the bigger one because it's bigger, right? And my thinking probably being like, it might be better if my opponent draws a blocker. Okay, that makes sense, right? That's a reasonable logic. But maybe I will look at it and go, I did see 2 copies of Legion's Judgment. I didn't see anything else that kills, small creatures. Was it actually incorrect for me to keep it? And I'll talk to people about it. I'll think about it, right? I'm going to put scrutiny on it. And I might come up with the idea that, it was kind of weird, but in this case, I actually could have played around 2 known cards with no other, known cards that would beat me. Yeah. But a lot of times I'll come to the conclusion that no, because if my opponent drew, half or more of their creatures, I would have been much happier to have this lethal threat that can attack into it and force a chump block rather than one that might not even be able to attack at all. So, even though I got a little unlucky and they drew the right removal spell and I may have won the game had I played otherwise, I may still come to the conclusion, well, let's not forget all the upside to the choice I did make. And then, I'll kind of move on from the decision one way or the other. And occasionally you will look at that and go, wow, it actually was a mistake to sack the big creature there. That is not the standard play, and it's not something that would happen very often. But given what I've seen from my opponent, I've convinced myself that, yes, in fact, I should have kept it. It's just rare that actually happens.
Yeah, and we don't want to give you a shield either by saying, like, I made the right play, but, got unlucky. You do have to fact check yourself, like you said. I guess the biggest, to try to give you a more useful takeaway, because we have, kind of gone over this a lot, try to, before you find the results, firmly in your mind identify why you made a specific play and what the reasons are, because that's going to help you make that play too. Like what the logic you just went through. Yes, normally when you have to decide whether to lose a 3/3 or 4/4, you're going to lose the 3/3. But then you're saying, like, well, I saw 2 copies of Legion's Judgment in game 1, and then you can decide, okay, because of that, I'm going to do this play. I'm going to lose my 4/4. Then if they draw a creature that makes your plan bad, or they draw Vanquish the Weak, you don't get to say, like, God, why did I do that? I got unlucky. You can say, like, okay, I did it for this reason. And then maybe afterwards, if you're interested, you can try to ask your opponent, just so you know, like, what did you have, or how many of these did you have? That shouldn't have changed your play because you just didn't have that information, but it's good to know for reference, like kind of what your gut said versus what the facts were. And as long as you know why you're making a play, I'm not going to fault you too bad for it, because that's the way you learned. The people I think who tend not to do well or to tend not to improve are people who just make plays without firm plans behind them. And I'm not saying you need to know how every turn of every game is going to play out, but know why you're doing a thing. At the very least, know why you're taking the action. And if you get in the habit of justifying those actions to yourself before you find out the results, I think you're going to long term end up with better results overall.
Yeah, that's great. That's really great advice. And, when you get to a certain level as well, you get to this point where your autopilot gets pretty strong, right? Like in this case, the obvious 90+% of the time choice would be to keep the bigger creature. And you might not have it in your head, well, I'm doing this for these reasons. But often you can go back and you might have taken a different line had you actually thought in that way.
Look, the other thing I wanted to mention is us as humans are very, very good about, making up narratives post-decision.
Oh, yeah.
You can very easily put together all sorts of excuses. So
yeah, if you want those, they're available to you. It doesn't help you, but they're there.
So it's very tempting to do that. So I'm just warning that's why I think have it firmly in your head why you're doing a thing for a specific reason, and then later you can tell yourself whether you did it right or wrong. But you need to know for your analysis later. Yeah,
and by the way, bringing friends in to these decisions helps out a lot, especially ones that aren't afraid to be honest with you and not just say, oh, tough luck, man, you'll get him next time. Instead, to say something like, look, here's my reasoning for why I would make the play that I made or why you shouldn't have made the play you made. And that's a good way to push you forward as well. This actually dovetails nicely into our next question from John Costello, who says, I find I have trouble identifying when to use things like combat tricks or removal. It feels like I often use my spells a turn early or a turn late. What can I look for to have a better idea of when my cards will give me maximum value? And he says he loves the show. Thank you, John. This is a great one that kind of touches on a couple of subjects that we've talked about here, Luis, which is, that urgency that newer players feel of like, oh, I've got this thing, I'm going to use it, right? I'm going to use this combat trick right now. I'm going to use this removal spell right now to just kill whatever's in front and start attacking you with no real thought for the next turn or the next 3 turns or, the way that the game actually plays out. And I think a lot of people find themselves in the spot that John's in, right? Where they feel like they just keep missing it. It's like, oh man, I used my removal spell. I finally, like, I held it in my hand for 2 turns. I was smart. I didn't use it on the bear because I had this 2/3. I'm like, okay, I'm going to keep my removal spell. And then they played a 3/3 and I thought, oh, I got to use it. And I used it. And then they played their bomb and now I didn't have removal. And I just got completely smoked by this, this bomb rare or whatever. Same things with combat tricks. They find themselves in positions where it's like, they're almost guessing, right? They're like, I attack with all these creatures. Okay, those creatures are attacking. I guess I'll use my combat trick here. But they don't really have a context for when and why to use, these spells when they do it. So what advice would you give to somebody about when, right? The timing on these tricks, what's your threshold for what you're willing to get out of these spells? I think is another way to ask the question.
It's tricky because at first, everyone's in the mindset of like, I have a removal spell, they have a creature. This is easy. Kill their creature.
Yeah.
And then you start getting to the point of like, I should have been a little more selective. I shouldn't have just spewed this right away. The way the limited formats are these days, you're actually rewarded pretty heavily for just killing their creatures right away.
It does happen more than before. That's true. But it is not, a blanket rule by any stretch.
No. What you want to factor in when you're trying to use a removal spell is like, how else can I deal with that creature, right? Like if they have a 2/2 out and you have a Vanquish the Weak, but you don't have anything in play and your first play is not going to be for like 2 turns, but your hand is like, let's say your hand is Vanquish the Weak, Prosperous Pirates, and they have a 2/2 out and you're at like 16. I'm not almost never killing their 2/2.
Hell no.
Just take 4 and play my 3/4s. And then on the other hand, if they have a 2/1 flyer and I have that same hand, I'm almost always killing it because I have nothing on the horizon that deals with it.
Yeah, that thing could easily do 8-10 damage to you before you find an answer, and it might even do more.
Yeah. So you want to know, like, what are the next couple turns going to look like? How many times is that going to hit me? Because killing a 2/2 is not that exciting. But what if you think that 2/2 is going to hit you 4 times? Mm-hmm. What about then? You're not just killing a 2/2. You're killing a 2/2 and gaining 8 life. That's usually worth it, right?
Right. And by the way that you're doing this, I think is we should come up with a name for this, some silly acronym or whatever. But this is the way that pros break down plays, right? And you, to me, are the absolute best at this because I've often asked you, like, well, why did you do this? Just for my own, I was curious, or maybe you and I are in the booth and I say, why did Reed do this? And, I just want to hear how you think it through and that kind of stuff. And you're really good at saying, okay, these are the scales. On one side of the scale, you're using some amount of mana and this removal spell. On the other side, what are you getting? Right? And because the snapshot of that is straightforward. Well, you kill a creature, right? But what like the little, shortcut that you just used there, you're like, well, you're gaining 4 life because, if you don't use a removal spell, you're taking the 4 and you're killing the creature. Okay. So that's a thing that, I might want to do that, a turn earlier, but Magic situations can get much, much more complicated than that. But that heuristic, that little tool that you use, Luis, I think is really like, if people listening can try to equate what's really happening here, I think that they can actually learn quite a bit about the true exchanges that they're making within the game rather than just, I spent card, I killed card, done. Right.
Because there's this invisible, element that's not just the cards that are being talked about. It's what's going to happen over the next couple turns. It's similar as to like, would you Vanquish the Weak a 1/1? Most of the time, no.
Right.
1/1 no text is not worth killing. But what if you had a 5/1 in play? Well, then you're getting to hit them for 5. So when you kill their creature and deal 5 to them, most people are in for that.
Yeah.
But sometimes people will look at that and be like, I don't want to use Vanquish on a 1/1.
Right.
And it's like, that's not what we're asking. We're asking what are the impact of the game. Because all these cards they're just game pieces. And they just have an effect on the game. And you just need to figure out what is how is this game going to progress and what am I getting out of it immediately or over the next couple of turns. It's a little easier to see that, right, if it's this turn. But you can also predict over the next couple of turns, like, yeah, that 2/1 flyer is going to hit me 4 more times. I should kill it. Mm-hmm. So that is really how you want to calculate these things. And there's no firm threshold on when to use removal or not. I can't give you that answer, but my bar to use removal does go up if I know they have like a Glorybringer in their deck to use the last format as an example.
Yes.
If I know they have Glorybringer, I'm very, very unlikely to use removal that can kill Glorybringer on a non-Glorybringer creature.
Right. You're going to do it as a last effort, you're going to keep it as long as you can.
If the Scarab God in their deck, I'm not casting Puncturing Blow on anything.
Right. Totally. Yeah.
That's just a way to lose games. On the other hand, the average 2-drop in Innistrad, I'll cast Vanquish on if I have 3 mana and had no play.
Yep, which is a format specific thing, but it is true. And that is really what you're doing whenever I think about whether to use removal. And remember, as a baseline, you should try to value your removal. Your removal is the hot commodity in Limited. It is not creatures, right? Those are the most important thing because, that's how you're going to end up winning the game in the vast majority of games. But removal is the one tool that you get, and you should be discretionary with it. You should have a reason to use it when you use it. And what I'm usually thinking about is, do I have other ways to deal with that threat? It's that simple. Just can I deal with it otherwise? And that goes to the examples that Luis just gave. And so I'm always thinking in those terms. I can double block. I can use my creature to block. I can take it. I can just take 2 damage for a few turns and be okay with it. These are all alternative options to using a removal spell, which I want to use in one of 2 scenarios primarily. One, if I can get a 2 for 1. Right? If I can set it up so that my opponent either can't attack me or does attack me and tries to use a combat trick or something along those lines, and I can kill their creature in response, or kill something with an aura on it or whatever, because that's a major advantage in the game. Or 2, I use my removal on a spell that my board can't beat otherwise, like a Glorybringer, for example, because it's big, evasive, and it kills, whatever was going to block it or tangle with it anyway. And so that's the type of card that can take over the game if left unchecked. And those are the type of cards I want to keep my removal spells for. Now, the thing that you learn quickly, though, is that you can't always do that. And to go back to Luis's point about, okay, they have a 2/1 flyer on turn 2. You don't have any way to interact. You will not be alive to use that removal spell on their Glorybringer because their 2/1 is going to kill you beforehand. And in those scenarios, it's very wise to use your removal as quickly as you can to save as much of that damage and get yourself further into the late game and that kind of thing.
The other thing I want to mention is condition removal has like a way, way, way lower bar.
Yes, fire it off.
Yeah, Vanquish the Weak is a card that's not going to kill their 6-drop. So you're going to use it on their 2-drop a lot of the time because it's not going to get better later. Mm-hmm. Whereas when you're talking about, Doomblade, 1 and a black, just kill target non-black creature. Yeah, that card can kill basically anything. So you're really unlikely to fire that card off on turn 2.
No, that's a really, really strong point, too, because it is funny how much that sliding scale changes. On conditional removal, man, I just want to get my value out of it. Like a 1-for-1, totally fine. And I think that Vanquish the Week's a perfect example, the one that you use, because if my opponent's tapped down and there's like a reasonable threat, I will usually just kill it because I don't want to get blown out by a pump spell, right? I don't want to risk the downside to a spell like that where, with my, big time removal spells, that's different. Next question comes from Thomas. It's actually 2 people had similar questions. I'll throw them both at you here, Luis. Tim Day and Thomas Hummel says, thanks for the podcast. One thing that I still struggle with is playing too fast. Sometimes I'll make a pick out of a pack and realize I couldn't even say what all the cards were in the pack. Just boom, you just windmill slam it. Mostly this happens during games though, where I pick out a line of play and immediately just start going with it, only realizing after that I hadn't even considered other possible lines. And Tim says, hey guys, love the show. I've been playing Magic off and on for a good 10 years now, and your show has made me a much better player. I feel given enough time, I can make the best play or close to it, but all too often that amount of time gets me clocked. When I try and play faster, I start making much worse plays so that when I slow down again and lose the game, from a winning board position. I understand that there's probably no big secret method you have, but do you have any advice on playing faster but not worse? Thanks for the podcast and your CFB videos. Although watching LSV play so fast makes me sick, he says. He included a smiley face on there as well. So this is one that you're kind of the master at because you are known as one of the fastest players on the Pro Tour as far as how quickly you process the information and make your plays. But was that always the case for you? And B, what advice do you have to people who, I fall into the first camp with Thomas there, where I do find myself occasionally speeding through and just being like, there were other choices you could have considered and you just didn't. And yeah, your autopilot might have got you there, 80% of the time, but there's that, 10 to 20% of the time where it's not. And I'm just, not taking the time to make sure. Where do you stand on all this stuff?
Well, Part of it is that how much of your processing you kind of offload does increase your pace of play. Because when you mentioned autopilot actually, it has a negative connotation, right? You're like, I was playing on autopilot. I wasn't thinking,
Yep.
But honestly, you can't run through a long tournament without relying on your autopilot stuff. Because you're just going to be exhausted. Look, you can't open every turn of Magic and derive from first principles what the plays are. You can't be like, evaluate the entire board always.
I would not want to play that game.
But some people do that. And what I can recommend to you is try to make it so that your subconscious picks up more of the load, so that your autopilot game is stronger. Part of that is practice. Playing a ton of matches helps. Playing on Magic Online helps because you can kind of get into this flow state of playing quickly, and that trains you to know what the right decisions are. And trusting your intuition is really important. It was pretty scary for me when I first started to. There was a time when I wouldn't do things that my intuition told me to do because I'd be like, I don't know, I feel like this is the right play, but
because you couldn't specifically say why.
Yeah, I can't always. I can't. Look, when pressed, I can explain why I did all these plays I made. But sometimes when I'm feeling about a card they could have or a way they're playing, I'm like, why do I think they have a giant growth? I think they do, but why do I think? And when I couldn't answer it satisfactorily, I would not play around it, and they would have it more often than not. Not like I'm always right or anything. So learning to trust those feelings is important. I think that if you want to increase your pace of play, part of it is try to figure out what you're spending a lot of time on and reduce that in some cases. Marshall, if you and I, we have this experience a lot, right? We're on coverage. Game one finishes and we do a live look and we just jump into another match.
Yep.
We're thrust into this match and there's 4 creatures on each side of the board and both players have 3 cards in their hand. And we're just like, what is going on here?
Right.
And that is really hard to figure out, right? We do a little scrambling. You say whatever normal filler words.
I start talking so that you can soak it in. Yeah, exactly.
And that's because we're trying to evaluate from nothing this entire board. The players in that game don't have that experience. You don't have that experience because when you are playing this game, first there's 1 creature, then there's 2. Then there's maybe back to 1, then there's 2, then there's 3, then there's 4. But you were there every step of the way. What you shouldn't be doing is starting every turn and being like, wow, how do I evaluate this whole board? Because it should be incremental. You should grow your understanding of the game turn by turn and not have to figure everything out immediately. So it's important to kind of keep up with the game, but also not spend a ton of time figuring everything out.
Redoing everything again? Yeah, right. That makes sense.
Let's say you have a 3/4 and they have 2 2/2s, right? You're not going to attack into that without a trick most of the time because that's just not a favorable trade. You don't need to every turn think about whether you should attack with your 3/4 if they still have those same 2/2s out. When you draw a combat trick, sure, that's a good time to decide, okay, actually I should attack. When it turns out one of those 2/2s is going to become valuable, let's say as an expensive activation cost, and it's getting close to that, you're playing an Ixali's Keeper or something, sure, maybe you're going to end up wanting to attack. But for the most part, you don't need to spend time thinking about that again. And I think a lot of these people do end up doing that.
Yeah.
So it's hard to play fast. I mean, it is. Some people have a real struggle with it. Nassif's in the Hall of Fame and he goes to time every round. He literally plays too slow.
Right.
So, but I think if you want to improve your pace of play, Magic Online helps because you're under a clock all the time and it's just your clock. So you get used to playing under that time pressure, and that'll help make it so you're not panicking. It also help make you, have visual evidence of how fast you're playing. If every single match you have 2 minutes left and your opponents always have 10 minutes left, you're like, okay, I definitely need to play slower or faster,
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think that the simple answer to get quicker is to just play more. That's what it took for me. I was pretty slow at first as well. Now I probably play a little too fast for my own good. But the fact is that mental offloading that Luis touched on is really important. I used to have to think about every single thing that was going on in the game. I needed to ping my opponent on end step, or they have a creature that gives everything first strike, and all these things that I would have to constantly be checking over and over again in my head. And I developed the skill of offloading that. I put a mental note that says, make sure you ping at the end step, and I'll just do it. There it is. Okay. End step ping. And before I would forget it all the time. And because I'd get excited about drawing my card, or my opponent would take a long turn and say go. And, I still occasionally do, but for the most part, I can do that kind of stuff. And the onboard stuff, I, up to a point, can just track all of it now. And I'm not thinking about it consciously. It's just a fact. Okay, everything's got first strike. And, I'm proceeding accordingly, and I'm thinking about more intricate stuff. So the only way I was able to do that was by just playing a lot, though. So play more. Next one is from Greg Holmes, who says, how detailed of notes should I be taking during a match?
That varies from person to person. I would suggest you do not take notes. I think that
you suggest no notes. Interesting. I don't take them either, but I'm curious to hear why you'd say don't do it.
I think that most people who take notes are generally not improving their win percentage by doing that. The one exception I will say is I think it's worth writing down like combat tricks that your opponent plays or relevant spells in that regard.
Okay.
But for the most part, I don't think that you should take detailed notes. Like I see people who like write down every time something deals damage what the source of the damage is. Yep. I see people who write down every card someone plays.
Yep.
Like you have to figure out what your attention span can hold, but I don't think that you should go really deep on taking notes. It just does not seem like it's profitable.
Yeah. And the thing is that you have to recognize that there is a cost to it as well. It seems like a free roll, but you are being distracted and you are taking time while you're actually taking the notes down. So, it makes sure that if you are doing it, it's going in the other direction. But I think that the better long-term plan is to, like one argument I could hear is like, okay, well, I write down every card my opponent plays. And that way, like if we go to a game 3, I just look over it all and I try to figure out what other types of cards could my opponent have in their deck? What is this deck trying to do? It gives me a bigger picture snapshot. And that's true. But what else you should be doing is figuring that out as you play, right? You should just be thinking, okay, they're green-white. They're all about +1/+1 counters, and they're going to make big creatures. And my, pounce doesn't look so good here because their creatures are going to be bigger. And, those are the things that I think that you should be sort of crunching as you just play. Right. And also you can do a lot of this stuff when you're not actually at the table.
Yeah. I just don't want you to use a lot of mental energy on figuring out what's in the game because, you only have so much to go around, and writing stuff down is going to distract you from like what's going on in the game.
Yeah. Next question comes from Alyssa, who says, hi, Marshall and Luis. Usually the biggest time I make mistakes is when I'm playing from behind with a more aggressive deck. For example, if I'm playing an aggro deck and my opponent is stabilizing with a more mid-range or controlling deck, I'm often unsure whether to start making crazy bluff attacks with everything I can just to get in damage, or to sit back and hope I can draw into something that can help me. I often find myself panicking and just making bad attacks for fear that that they'll stabilize if I don't, or not attacking when I should be and letting the game slip away. Got any tips for how to play correctly in this situation? And then Ian also had a similar question, except for flipped. Ian says, I think that I play okay from behind. I'm able to figure out my outs and determine what parts of the board state or deck actually matter and which parts don't. I think this is because, I think this is because when there's only one line, the line of I don't lose the game, it's very easy to decide to play that line. I struggle with decision making more when I'm ahead. So this is two different takes on a similar problem of finding themselves in a situation and not knowing how to proceed from there. And I think Alyssa's question is particularly poignant because she actually brings up something that I think a lot of players don't really accept when they play, which is, so she says, I'm playing an aggro deck and then I got behind. Your aggro deck is bad when it's behind. That's the downside to playing an aggro deck, right? Like you kind of signed up for that, when you draft that type of deck, depending on how aggressive you go with it. And I think she's right, though, to think, okay, well, should I be taking these crazy lines and that kind of stuff?
What your goal is when you play a game of Magic is to win. It's not to keep the most material. It's not to get 3 for 1. Right. And the unpleasant truth of playing aggro decks, like you said, is when you're behind, your deck's not as good. Yeah, you've got to do some ugly things. Sometimes you throw away 3 creatures to get 1 point of damage through, because that means if you top deck your 3 damage spell, you'll win the game.
Right.
And
even though it looks like pure desperation, and it is.
Yeah, I mean, it literally is. But I think that's still something you have to be okay with. And this is interesting because I don't know how you are, Marshall, but most people I know play better from behind than they do while they're ahead.
Definitely.
Because when you're behind, there's just psychological, like, you this you're going to lose the game. You got to pull out every trick of the book, all your will and scrap for that 5% chance to win. And somehow that people are into that. But then they play real sloppy when they're ahead. They're like, oh, I was supposed to tap their land during their upkeep. Whatever. Then the opponent draws a wrath.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, this, of course, does touch on kind of a sliding scale that you'll hear most really good professional players talk about. And I hope that it's starting to creep into the minds of our listeners as well, which is this idea of, playing more conservatively while you're ahead and taking on more risk while you're behind.
Yeah, that is the classic. It's like when you're, 80% to win the game, you're willing to try to like spend a few percentage points to cut off an out that they have, right? You're the one who doesn't want to take a point of damage to end up losing to a top deck burn spell. When you're 10% to win the game, you'll throw everything away to try to draw that one card next turn and win the game. So your risk tolerance goes up dramatically the more you're losing.
Right. So, I think that both of our questions here from Ian and from Alyssa are both reasonable in the sense that, like, Alyssa, you should be cranking up you should be rationing it up. And yeah, sometimes the game slips away from you. But again, that's kind of what you signed up for. And for Ian, adjust that slider down a little bit, right? Keep your focus. And
it's a little harder for Alyssa because you have to know when you're playing aggro what your outs are. Do you have a 3 damage spell in your deck? Do you have a 4 damage spell? Do you have non-flying creatures can't block? Do you have tap 2 creatures? Like, be aware of what those cards are so you can try to manufacture the board state where those cards win you the game.
That's right. And again, I think that there is an element to just accepting the limitations of your deck as well. Because for every time that you get off to a good start, but the opponent stabilizes and there really wasn't anything that you could do to prevent it, there's going to be times when you run them over because they miss a land drop, or they miss a color, or you have the right curve out of 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop combat trick removal spell, and they just can't do anything. And you're getting, they're obviously not free wins, right? But that's where you're getting the benefit from playing that type of deck. But that benefit does come at a cost. If it didn't, everybody would just always play aggro decks. And even though it kind of feels like that's how it's been for the past year, limited tends to vary more than that. Okay. Next question comes from Tyler. It says, hi guys, sealed question here. How important are bombs in color determination?
This is an easy one. Very important.
They're quite important, yes.
One of the things that we have not run into a sealed format yet where we didn't give this advice, which is you should be playing your best cards. Like, you should jump through hoops to play your, like, let's say, top 1 or 2 rares. Like, when you open a Glorybringer or when you open a Hostage Taker, those cards should be in your deck a very high percentage of the time.
Right. Which sucks because, like, I like the world where that's not the case, but we do live in that world.
That's just where sealed format is.
Yep. So very important is the answer. Guillaume says, hi, Marcel and Luis. I've been listening to the show since the first John Laux episodes and been a patron since September of 2016. Thank you, Guillaume. We appreciate that. One mistake I often make when playing Magic is not reassessing the board state. I found myself forgetting an ability of a creature might have or a particular opponent, a possible activated ability, etc. How can I get myself to always update the information without taking too much time?
That is a tricky one.
Yeah, the thing I mentioned earlier is one way, which is to build in a process into your basically every turn routine where, again, you draw your card, assess the board state. And the thing is that you have to get quick at this, right? Like, ideally, it just takes half a second. But some players do need to kind of, take a breath and look and say, okay, what is really going on here? Am I ahead? Am I behind? How close am I to dead? What does my opponent's board state look like? What does mine look like? What does this turn look like if I play this card from my hand or this other card from my hand? I think that is a reasonable thing to do. It's just you do need to work at it so that you can do it quickly, because you will not be able to finish matches if you literally every turn draw your card and just, start from a clean slate and just rebuild the board state. That's not a reasonable way to approach Magic, because as we talked about earlier with the speed of play thing, it is a requirement to be able to play competitive Magic that you can play at a pace in which you can finish the match reasonably. So
playing, it's also not fun if your opponent takes 4 minutes a turn.
No, it's terrible. So, but I like just having a one spot per turn where you just physically use your eyeballs to look over at what's on the other side and just say, okay, all right, everything has first strike. Okay, draw my card for the turn, right? Because oftentimes it's like, well, there's 3 creatures. They don't do anything other than attack or block, and I've got my stuff, so I'm going to draw my card, and that should just take you half a second.
Yeah, I don't really know what to add more than that.
Yeah, I mean, there's not a secret.
This is part of Magic, is starting to get used to what's on the board. And I don't really know how you can necessarily improve that besides just getting better at it.
Yeah, for sure.
Just trying to pay attention, what's important, that sort of thing.
Next one comes from Leiden, who says, "Hey, Marshall and LSV, I think the biggest place I find myself making mistakes is not understanding some of the medium to complex rules interactions, like if a creature has death touch and trample, for example. What's the best way to learn these type of interactions? Sometimes I feel like I'm missing potential plays because I don't understand how a complex card on my side interacts with other cards on the board."
I mean, Death Touch and Trample is one of the more complex ones, and of course, that interaction is that a creature with both of those abilities assigns 1 to each blocker and the rest to the opponent. So your 4/4 Death Touch Trample being blocked by a 5/5, your opponent will take 3.
That's right.
Death Touch and First Strike, similar. A creature with Death Touch and First Strike is a good creature because it kills its blockers before they deal damage.
Yeah, to me, Leiden, this isn't a question of experience because these are unintuitive. Like the reason why you don't understand them at face value is because they're unintuitive. It's like, well, why? Right? Why does the Death Touch do it? And I know why. It's because the rule says that in order, you have to assign at least lethal damage to each creature as it is ordered in front of your creature. And it turns out that if you've got Death Touch, 1 is lethal because any amount of damage from that creature is lethal. So you're only required to do 1. And Trample says any additional damage, beyond lethal, you can apply to the player. And so I'm like, oh, okay, I get that. But I needed to have that explained to me by a judge, right? You don't just know that coming into Magic. And there's a lot of things like that. So this to me is simply a matter of experience and matter of willing to be curious, to ask judges. They have made themselves very available. There's a judge chat. There's judges on Twitter. They're all over, any major tournament you go to. And I'll tell you what, they love talking about this stuff. Like you go up to a judge and say, "Can you explain to me how Death Touch and Trample interact?" Oh, they're going to sit you down. Drinks will be ordered. Like they're going to love that. And don't be afraid to use that as a resource because they know their stuff and they're really helpful. But the thing is that you got to just play a lot, watch coverage, watch people stream, and you're going to pick up on these interactions one by one. And to me, you just got to build them up in your playbook because you can't really research them, right?
No, honestly, Death Touch is one of the more complicated ones. Other than that, for most keywords, there's not that many weird interactions. Card by card, you just kind of have to know what the cards do.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you look at basically, if there's something you don't understand, like you said, call a judge, but don't worry too much about exactly understanding the comprehensive rules of Magic. You can just stick to the cards you have in play and try to figure out weird interactions from there.
Jason asks, he says, I've played a few competitive events, mostly a GP in the last year, where I've had a good record going into the final rounds of a long day of Magic, but my rate of mistakes seems to increase exponentially after 9 hours of play. He says that he looks at his hand and it just feels like he's looking at a bunch of blank cards and even makes, mistakes that he just feels like he would not make if he weren't fatigued. What can he do to avoid this level of fatigue and the mistakes that come along with it? This is hard.
That is tough because there's no real substitute. We say practice, but you can't practice playing 12 hours of Magic at a GP setting very easily. You can go to your local store all day, but it's not the same.
No, it's really not.
Experience helps. Honestly, being in good physical shape helps.
It does. Yeah.
It sounds funny, but it really does. And because your body is just more, resistant to pressure and making sure this is the standard trope. Eat and drink over the course of the day.
Yeah. And don't forget sleep though. This is the one thing that I had to learn for myself on coverage was that I used to just go and then draft after coverage and not get enough sleep. And I found that, being in the booth is really hard. It's very taxing mentally, and that I would start to get tired and I felt like it was starting to affect me. And so I stopped doing that stuff. I just, would go to bed and get more rest than I thought I needed because I was working my brain that much harder when I was, doing coverage. And it's the same thing when you play in a GP. You're working your brain pretty hard. And that means that when your friends are like, hey, we're going to go do this thing after the day. Do you want to come with us? You know, if you're really serious about it, you may need to say, I'm going to go to dinner and then I'm going to skip out. I'm sorry, guys, but, you know, sleep is critical and you need more than you would normally get at home in most scenarios to keep up.
I know that in our experience, when we're doing a whole day of coverage, like we're like constantly hungry because you're actually burning more calories when you're thinking.
Yeah. I mean, Luis and I are all like, we get off at the round and then it's like pistachios, you know, mango, like we're just eating the whole day. I'll eat much bigger meals on the road when I know I'm going to be doing that to make sure I don't get hungry.
Or be gluttons, but
that is true. Yes.
But this is even more because we are literally using more calories. It's actually just a fact. If you're doing a very concentration intensive task and your brain is working, you use more calories. Yeah. It's, you know, so
into the maw.
Well, keep that in mind when you might be used to like playing Magic and I'll get something to eat after Magic. Well, you're going to burn through those resources.
All right. Well, I'm gonna do a few more questions here, Luis, but we have way too many for one show. I mentioned that these ones are really good. I'm wondering if we just want to save these, and I really want to do these other questions. We're going to be able to do a few more here, but we're like halfway through. Like,
I'm game to just keep plowing on these, and you know. I know the listeners hate when we run over on the show, like they really want us to keep it to a tight hour, but right. We gotta slug through some more of these.
Okay, well let's just keep going. Then this one comes from Jonathan. It says, started listening to the show a few months ago, and I felt a huge boost in my limited results since then. So thank you. You're welcome, Jonathan. One thing I'm still struggling with is a balance between creatures and other spells. I've had some good drafts in different formats where I found open colors and ended up with 6 or more good removal spells and a few tricks and card draw spells as well. But then, of course, I played too many of these and I lost the game because I had only removal in hand and not enough threats. What do you take into account to decide how many and which good non-creature cards to play in your deck? And this is a great question, Jonathan, because this is goes to the very heart, the very fundamental of limited and even of Magic in many ways these days, which is that creatures are king. The creatures are what matters the most out of anything. And sometimes that just means having critical mass of those creatures. You know, you want to be running between 13 and say 17 creatures in your decks most of the time. You know, I usually aim for about 15 on like an average kind of, you know, normal format style deck. That only leaves you 7, 8, maybe 9, you know, slots for non-creature spells. And what that means is you need to be picky. You need to be really picky about which ones you put in your deck to make sure that they're doing their thing. Your number one, removal, of course, right? And you're going to run most of the good removal that you get. It's rare for you to leave a good removal spell in your sideboard. It means that something weird happened in the draft where you were the only person in a color or you just got extraordinarily lucky. In the vast majority of drafts you do, you are going to run all of your good removal spells. So you've got that going for you. That's going to eat up however many slots you got of removal. Then the next ones are kind of your fun slots. So those are the slots that you get to play different types of things. Combat tricks. Sure. That's a spot for those right there. And you'll know if your deck wants to be playing a bunch of combat tricks or if you're more of a control or, you know, later mid-range deck that doesn't value them quite as highly. Card draw spells. Great. I mean, everybody loves a card draw spell, but they don't do anything to the board, and they're a little overpriced these days on average. So you're going to have to be picky about which ones and how many you run.
Just not where you want to be most of the time.
Yeah. And so you need to do that. And then that leaves the other stuff, right? An artifact that can ramp you or get you card advantage or do scry or do something weird like that. An enchantment. Right. And I'm assuming that we're not talking about a built around, you know, kind of theme deck or whatever. We're talking about your more average, you know, curve out style mid-range deck, you know, an enchantment that helps you win or affects your creatures or whatever. These are the slots for those things. But your number one always is creatures. That is how you're going to win the game. They act as removal when you need to block. They act as your win condition when you can attack with them. And you need to make sure that you have enough of them and that you're playing the best possible ones you can in the best configuration. The rest, you know, the removal plays itself. You will play as much of the good removal as you can. And then the other slots that's your spot to experiment. That's your spot to try out stuff and see what works and what doesn't and keep track of those cards as you go through.
Yeah. And like a corollary to that is So it might make sense sometimes to cut creatures for removal, and if you have high quality removal, you can skimp a little on the creatures.
Mm-hmm.
But at some point, when you cut too many creatures, you're going to have to start using removal on their bad creatures.
Yes, we've all been there. Yes, it's true. Yeah. And remember, your creatures are your removal in many cases. They block, and that's what they're there for, just as much as attacking in some decks. Matthew Taylor says, hey, Marshall and LSV, I had an unusual loss at a recent Iconic Masters draft. My opponent was locked out of drawing they're locked out of drawing cards due to their own necropotence, but I lost by casting a Sphinx of Uthun into the last card in my opponent's hand, a Grisly Spectacle, taking me from 10 cards in my library to 0 in a single turn. I'm not sure if I made the wrong choice here, but I certainly didn't see that line coming. They weren't playing a mill strategy. What can I do to be more aware of my opponent's outs when I have incomplete knowledge of their deck? And Matthew, I love this question because it touches on something that you and I just talked about, Luis, which is when you are so far ahead, you actually have the luxury of taking these absurdly narrow lines that say, what can I play around? What could possibly go wrong here, and play around those?
In this particular case, I think that it was foreseeable. This is something I would have played around because Grisly Spectacle is common. And giving your opponent the out of a common is not generally acceptable, especially when they're locked out of drawing additional cards.
Yeah, they're sitting there with one card in their hand and they can't do anything for the rest of the game, and you get to just sit there and draw cards. That's the situation Matthew is in.
Yeah. So basically, here's my bar for playing around stuff. The more you're winning, the more it goes up. That's just normal. I tend to play around commons and uncommons at a pretty high rate. I tend not to play around rares unless I have a reason to believe they have it. If you have 4 creatures out and your opponent's at 2, sure, don't play your 5th creature. I think most people realize that. But if you have 2 creatures out, I'll play my 3rd. I'm not playing around their rare wrath in that spot because it's just so unlikely they have it. I don't want them to play 2 spells and all of a sudden stabilize.
Right.
So what you should be doing is having a good knowledge, an encyclopedic knowledge of all the commons and uncommons, and don't worry too much about rares. Like I said, you don't have to do that until you're actually in a spot where you know they have a specific rare. So,
yeah. And this is an interesting spot that he brings up because it's so incredibly narrow. There's no way that he can lose.
Yeah.
If the opponent has one card in hand and can't get rid of the necro, they're just stuck. They're just locked. That's it.
In this particular case, I'm actually looking at every card in the set, if I don't already know it, to try to figure out how can I lose to an opponent that has a bunch of black mana.
Right. Yeah. And that would be the one. So, narrow that list down further and further, the further ahead you are. And in Matthew's case, he was so far ahead that, you actually would have been very reasonable to play around it. Now, you do need to have that knowledge. If you just forgot the card existed, hey, that happens. But, sometimes you lose games because you forget a card existed, Cool scenario, by the way, Matthew. That is a very neat example. Chris says, guys, I overthink plays and turns too often. I need to remedy this, and I'm unsure how. And I am unsure how. We LR listeners clearly devote a lot of our time to thinking about Magic, and because of this, I rack my brain at times during games, only to realize afterwards that the play was simple, right in front of me, and I tried to get too clever. Misused resources and misused opportunities abound. Help! So, fancy play syndrome. This is something that we've talked about on the show over the years. Is similar to what Chris is doing. He's actually just going too deep, but fancy play syndrome is, where you think about a situation and it's relatively straightforward. Okay, well, you got a 2/2, I got a 2/2, but then you do start playing around rares, right? And you start thinking about, well, what if they have these exact 2 cards? I better not attack. It's too risky, and it's like, what are the chances they actually have those 2 cards in their hand? It's extremely low. And this is a good attack, if they don't have those 2 cards, right?
Player development where I can play around stuff and it just goes up a little too high. Most players end up there eventually.
Yeah.
The solution to that is don't worry as much about things that could happen. Just go back to kind of playing mostly on the board plus
one step away or something.
Yeah. Worry about the level 1 stuff. Don't worry about the combination outs of what if they have this plus this, that sort of thing.
Right. Yeah. I think that you're just simply overthinking it in most scenarios, Chris. And most of the time I talked about it earlier in the 80 to 90% range where a good autopilot is the correct choice. It's just those times when it's not. So maybe devote a little bit of energy to deciding when it is correct for you to really think things through. If it's a really high leverage play or a big moment in your match where you need to be aware of all those things, or where the game's literally on the line. But the times when it's not, it's okay to just go to the level one and just say, well, I don't want to get blown out by a combat trick, so I want to attack.
Because what separates good players from great players is the ability to find these really weird, complicated plays.
Yes.
But trying to do that makes you, in a lot of cases, there's a painful inflection point where you're worse than you were previously in terms of match win percentage, because you're trying to stretch your legs a little bit. And it sounds like this is where we're at here. So just be aware of that, and know that, like, ultimately you do need to learn these things, and ultimately you do need to make the more complicated plays, but don't be afraid to just make the base level fundamental play.
Next one comes from Rusty Sosha, who says, hey guys, I started playing Magic when Kaladesh came out, and through each of the formats I've noticed that I have a much better win percentage when I draft aggressive decks. I notice that when I deviate from more aggressive decks, I end up losing due to flooding or not having the right cards in hand. Perhaps me just blaming bad play. Can you offer any advice or rules of thumb for drafting mid-rangey decks or even control decks? We've talked about this a little bit on this one, but this is a big step for Rusty, right? This is where you go from being a player who says, I have one goal in mind and I know exactly how that goal is going to be met. And if it doesn't get met next game, to being a player who says, I need to adjust that on the fly. I need to know when I'm the aggressor, but I also need to know that might change and I'm not the aggressor anymore. And that's a big step. I mean, that's hard, right? Like, it's actually normal for Rusty to lose some percentage points going from one strategy to a much more complex strategy that shifts a lot more often. And that you can't just say, oh, well, I was the aggressor and it didn't come together. So, next game, you actually have to be able to look at yourself and say, well, did I make a mistake? Did I do something that was wrong? Rusty, I think it's just kind of taking your medicine, like you can't expect to just start drafting more complex decks and having more complex lines of play and not take a hit on your win percentage.
Yeah. And, there's a lot of things to learn, learning like what creatures are effective defensively, learning what percentage, like how many win conditions you need. Because one of the things that people frequently get wrong initially is like, I have too many expensive cards. I'm drafting control, so I need these like 5 expensive cards. Like, you really don't. Because just like in Constructed, the fewer expensive win conditions you can get away with, the better.
Right, exactly.
And, trying to figure out the ratio of card draw to if cards that affect the board is important. Trying to figure out when to take removal versus not. These are all things that you learn eventually. It is critical to get there, but you'll get the hang of it. And I think the biggest thing is just the fundamental difference in how you approach a game and how you approach it every turn, knowing you're going to win the long game versus not.
Yeah.
So in that sense, mid-range is actually a lot more difficult to play because it's more dynamic. Every single turn you have to evaluate, or in every single game based on your hand, am I winning the long game or is my opponent winning the long game? Because mid-range decks have to adjust themselves based on that a lot more often than aggro control decks do.
Sasha has a question. Hi, Marshall and Luis. This is my first post as a patron. Yeah, welcome along, Sasha. My biggest challenge I have is when I draft is when to jump ship into other colors. I try to stay open in pack 1 and set myself up for a few routes, but oftentimes I find myself going back into pack 3 as a weak 3-color deck rather than a strong 2. When's that point of no return? And then Carrie also has a similar question. I'd really like to hear some information about identifying when you should switch colors. I find that sometimes after a draft on retrospection, I realize that sometimes in pack 2, I should have switched into another color, but I'm always afraid to go too deep in the draft, or that I'm too deep into the draft at that point to switch.
The rule of thumb I use is mid pack 2 is about the time when you have to just commit one way or another.
Yep.
Ixalan is actually an outlier in that respect. I think Ixalan you have to be by about pick 5 of pack 1 or pick 6.
Yeah, I was going to say it's like pick 3. It's insanely early. Yeah.
But I think that in general about mid pack 2, and there's a couple things that go into switching. One is if you have 10 red cards and 4 white cards, it's way easier to switch because you have this base of red cards that lets you kind of combine with everything. And you can also see what cards you've already taken that might be all of a sudden back in play, right? Because you might have taken a card in pack 1 late, like a random like 4-cost 3/3, and realize, oh, if I switch colors, this is something I can use. Like, how many playables do I actually have? So I'd say about mid pack 2 is the general rule of thumb.
That's your point of no return. And for me, I also do a thing occasionally. I call it making an adult choice, right? Which is when there's a really tempting pick to go into some other color, but like I haven't really received any other signals for it, and it doesn't really make sense to do so, especially later in the draft, like when you're already in pack 2 or whatever. And I'll just sigh and take the kind of boring card in my colors and just say, nope, I'm not going to fall for this. And I'm going to be an adult here and make that pick. Those picks add up. Those picks matter and keep you a little bit more on track. So don't be afraid to just say, you know what, it's okay to pass a good card if it's, pack 2, pick 6, and you're not in those colors at all yet. Mark Rosen says, hey guys, I went to GP Cleveland, that's Team Sealed, last year, and our team built from a pretty weak pool 2 medium decks and one that could only draw or lose but not win. That sounds bad. Yeah, I'm pretty sure we made a mistake in deck building, but it's hard to say what's the best approach to splitting 12 packs into 3 decks and giving your team the best chance to win when the cards aren't great. Mark, we're going to keep this one a little bit shorter just because that's kind of an episode worth, right? Like, how do you Team Sealed? But do you have any bullet points for Mark?
In general,
open better.
If you first of all, open better. Second of all, try to make sure that you use all your gold cards. That's a one way to really focus
there you go.
Deck building. Try to make sure you're playing all your like good rares. If you're in a really unenviable spot, I'd rather have 2 good decks in a poor deck than 3 medium decks. I think that's something that you want to keep in mind. And if you're in a really, really bad spot, it's hard to prepare for that. Like, if you're in a spot as bad as what is being described here, I don't think you're going to be happy no matter where you end up. So I wouldn't stress too much about it. If your option is to make 1 good deck and 2 terrible decks, you're not going to make day 2, like, unless you get very lucky.
Yeah, there's no fix for that. Some pools are bad. Swordsman says, I noticed that top tier players have remarkable memory. They remember hands, board states, and opponents' actions from game to game and know exactly what cards were picked and what was left in packs for packs 1 through 8 of a draft. How do I improve my memory to help increase my winning percentage? Well, that's a tough question. I think that, like, the way for me, I don't know, this is really hard to describe, but, when I can remember stuff similar to this, like on drafts that I've done and board states that I've had that too, and I've had people say that. And the thing is that, like, my brain sees these things differently than it used to. It's not just a list of cards that I memorize, because that would be really hard for me to do, but I can like conceptualize of the things that are happening, or at least the important things that are happening. And so I'll remember not every card in the pack, but I'll remember the 3 cards that I care about. Right. And and those just tend to stick in your head. You're not like committing them to memory like actively. It's just sort of the thing that you were thinking about at the time. So then it sticks. Same thing with board states. It's like when you get into a board state, it's not just like remembering a whole bunch of cards on a board and a bunch of numbers with life totals and cards in hand and stuff. It's like you were in that moment. Like you conceptualize these things. And at least for me, that helps me, memorize those things a lot easier. Otherwise, I don't know. I mean, can you do memory exercises or something? Would you even do that?
I imagine you can. I imagine that is an actual thing. I think that it's a combination of what we're seeing here is selection bias. People who tend to be successful in Magic Invisible, I think, had good memories rather than trained them through Magic.
Sure. I think that makes sense.
There's some amount of that. And some of that is the longer you play Magic for, the more your mind is attuned to think about Magic and relate things to Magic and memorize Magic. Like, we both do coverage, right? And we know the names of all the cards and what they all do. Like, if we had to memorize like gear widgets, we would do a much worse job. Mm-hmm. But we've trained our brains to memorize Magic cards. And It wasn't like we went through necessarily a formal process to do that, but that is what we did based on what we do. So I think that the more time you spend around cards, you figure out, first of all, ways that your memory can get better by, like, do you take information off written or visual? Because some people memorize with like the cards in their hands, right? Like they have the whole set, like an actual physical set, and use it like flashcards. Some would rather read them. Some have like a spreadsheet. And, some people need to play with the cards. So you'll get a sense of what's best for you specifically through that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But this is part of why Magic is hard. How many questions today, including this one, have we said like you need to practice more?
Yeah, play more Magic helps fix these things. Yeah,
I really don't want that to be a cop-out because there are ways you can be more efficient in it, but a lot of that is you'll get a better sense for the memory of things as the more you do it.
Yeah,
and
it's true. It's just true.
You have to realize that.
Yep. Jared says, "Hi, gents. I think my biggest mistake is my inability to identify mistakes or why I lost a game." Luis often says things like, you think you lost a game because your opponent beat you, but in reality, it's because you played Harrier Naga. if someone isn't out there to point out...
It sounds like something I would say.
It does. If someone isn't out there to point out an obvious reason that I lost, how can I go about figuring it out?
Well, one is you can probably identify which turns are the most important, right? Like...
Yeah.
The turn where you double block and they have a combat trick is probably pretty important to the outcome of the game.
Right. Even if you lose 3 turns later, right?
Right. Or the turn where they play their, bomb rare, they play the Locust God, and you could have left up a counter spell but didn't.
Mm-hmm.
You can identify that. So one way to start is because even if, let's say, you're very bad at identifying mistakes, which is what it sounds like, this is self-admitted. Even if that's where you are going to have the highest % chance of figuring out a way the game could swing by identifying the plays that were made on the most important turns of the game. Even if you just were almost clueless as to what was a mistake or not, you're like, well, this turn had the most dramatic impact on the outcome of the game, so let's investigate what happened on this turn. And then you can look at like, oh, I chose to do this instead of this. And then analyze that. Even if you didn't know at the start it was a mistake, maybe by analyzing it, you'll see what exactly you could have done differently and how it was going.
Yeah, and this is another one where tapping in friends or people that were around or whatever is really helpful because it's like a brainstorming session, right? Like people say things that you didn't think about, but that spark something in your brain. Like they might say, well, you knew you passed him the Locust God, as if that would happen. But you know what I mean? So you knew that this opponent could have the Locust God, and yet you tapped down out of your counterspell on the turn when they were going to hit their land drop to play it. You might go, wow, I did know they had that, right? Or maybe they just say, I told you, but you're like, I did know, and I just left the shields down on this critical turn. And then you ask yourself, well, what did I tap out for? And it was for something that didn't really matter. And you think, wow, I really should have left up this counterspell. I might have avoided this whole mess, right? But if the person doesn't tell you that, you might just think, well, I had to play my creature, right? I didn't need to leave up my I didn't consider doing that. I just wanted to play my creature. I'm not going to not use up my mana here. And, even though the opposite line might have been much more correct. And you can really tap in, people that are at your level or even preferably higher than it to help you work through those situations. That can be tough. It takes work. That is one of the things that you can actually do after a match to actually figure out and get better, where a lot of things become a little abstract.
Well, one thing I think that can be useful is when you lose a match, and this is important, not when you win a match. When you lose a match, I think a lot of times if you ask your opponent, hey, what do you think are things I could have done differently, or did you see any big mistakes I made? Often your opponent will be willing to expound on that. Don't do that when you win. I think that's
definitely
not in good taste. Like some people will do that. Look, if you play against Ben Stark and you beat him, you can then ask him what mistakes you made and he'll tell you.
He won't mind. Yeah.
he doesn't care. But most people, if you win, just take the W and go. But if you lose, most of your opponents are going to be friendly and amenable to being like, yeah, I was really worried that you would, double block this turn, but you chose to attack me instead.
Right.
Or when you use the removal spell on my 4-drop, like I thought that was really good for me. Yeah. And sometimes that's a mistake, sometimes it's not. But it's a good way of knowing what your opponent thinks is important, which is a good way for you to figure out what you could have done differently.
Certainly matters. Andy says, one of the biggest mistakes I make is reading others at the draft table. I usually end up with a decent deck, but end up outclassed by my opponent. So I guess my question is it better to try to draft a great deck but pay less attention to the others, or go for an okay deck, but you stole a bomb from someone else? And the answer is, Andy, it is much better to go for a good deck yourself rather than try to figure out what everybody else at the table is doing. Look, you are inherently figuring out what other people are doing by staying open, right? You don't need to look over to the right and figure out exactly what color pair the person in your right is, or person 2 to your right or to your left or whatever. But what you are doing is you're saying, there's a saying in baseball, right? That goes way back. It's called and the saying is just hit it where they ain't. Right, just hit the ball where their player, like that's how you get good at hitting, is just to hit it where there's not a player there, right? And it's like, super simplified version, but that's what you're doing in draft, right? You're looking for the colors that are open. You're just saying, I'm going to pick the cards that has the colors that are open. And you don't necessarily need to know why that is. You might not even know that there's other players at the table, and you could just say, oh, there's an algorithm or a computer. I'm just going to draft the colors that I see the most open. Now, you can get an advantage by knowing these other things, but of the two choices that you gave, it's much better to just be introspective and look at what you're seeing rather than trying to interact with what the other players are doing in draft, like cut cards from them or whatever.
Yeah, I think that focusing on what's going on in your own neck of the woods is a lot more important than worrying too much about what's going on otherwise.
Yeah. Now, the best drafter, the optimal drafter, though, does, of course, consider both things. So that should be a goal for you, Andy. But, if you're at the point where it's messing you up to look at the other players, then don't, and just try to figure out what colors are open, and you'll be doing that inherently. James says, I was recently in a very long game one in a paper draft tournament. The board state was completely stalled. The game was crawling, and my opponent had a card draw engine that was slow, but gave him inevitability. His deck ran, jealous, right? His deck ran a lot of artifacts for which I had good answers in my sideboard, so I expected games 2 and 3 would be better for me. Still, I couldn't bring myself to concede game 1 and save that match time until he found a way to break through the stall. I feel like that was a mistake. Are there situations where you concede games that aren't lost to have a better chance at winning the match? What a great question from James.
It is really tricky to figure out when you should be conceding, because you don't want to give away like a game you're 7% to win. That's a pretty decent percentage.
Right.
But games you're 1% to win, that's a very different ballgame.
Mm-hmm. And when the clock's becoming an issue and you need to win 2 games, it's that pressure's really mounting at that point.
Yeah, I think overall I do a pretty good job or I want to concede a little more frequently than I should, because I just hate playing games that I'm losing. Because time is
so bad. Man, you need to toughen up. Take your 3%. Look, you can't leave it on the table.
I'm playing at the Pro Tour, I won't concede. But if I'm playing like on stream or on Magic Online, I'm just
come on. I'm not. I would never judge you for
turn 4, and I'm just out of there.
You just scoop it up. Yeah. Look, I'm not judging you for anything you do on your stream. I mean, you're doing the stream to have fun and hang out. It's the Pro Tour.
It's first of all, like, playing faster helps.
Yes, that is true.
This is a measurable advantage there. You get to play more games where you're losing, and that doesn't sound great, but you get a higher win percentage overall.
Yes.
And then I would also recommend trying to figure out what exactly you're drawing to and what your chances are. Like, I don't know this exact board state, but if my opponent has it such that they have a combination of cards which I know I'm not going to be able to break through, even if I haven't lost yet, how important is it to see their win condition exactly? The answer is it's not like super important.
No, it's extra value, but it's not critical. Like, I would certainly concede if I thought that there was a very good chance that this game was going to go to time. But, one thing I do when I find myself in that situation is I just play very quickly, because if I know I'm losing anyway, I'm just like, land, go.
Oh, that's a great point. You're not losing much there because your decisions aren't mattering that much, so just don't waste time on them. Just try to be like, all right, let's get this over with.
Yeah, and yes, you're going to get shown a few extra cards, and if you do have an out in the deck, you don't want to give up those games. That equity really does matter. But if I was convinced that I was going to lose the game, by a pretty overwhelming percentage, and I knew I had 2 games to go that I thought were favored, I would scoop. I would. Like in Dave's spot, I would scoop, and I would bring in my 6 sideboard cards, and then I'd also probably say something to my opponent. Oh, sorry, that was James, not Dave. But yeah, and I would probably say something to my opponent too. Just about, hey, we've got to finish 2 more games here, so let's make sure that we're playing quickly.
This is not related exactly to this question, but it is very true that don't be afraid to ask your opponent to play faster. I think it's fine. I think a lot of people it's awkward, but look, think of it this way: you're leveling up your social skills too, because asking people for things is a good thing to learn, because you have to do it a lot in life, and especially things that are going to annoy them. So
yeah, that's right. A couple more questions here. We actually are cruising now. Dave says, I'm a fairly new player, only started playing since the end of Aether Revolt, where I find constantly make mistakes around knowing how to double block. What are some general rules of thumb and ways to correct these mistakes when it comes to double blocking outside of being aware of open mana for a sure strike, which apparently has haunted poor Dave?
I think that double blocking, first of all, it's very powerful and something that you should learn how to use well because a lot of games come down to that. Second of all, first, figure out what's going to happen if no one has anything. If your opponent attacks a 4/4 into like a 2/3 and a 2/2, I assume something's up because no one wants to trade a 4/4 for a 2/3, right?
Right.
So, but on the other hand, if someone attacks a 4/4 into 2/2s, that's less suspicious to me because I mean, yeah, that's like a reasonable trade. I think people might make that just in general. Mm-hmm. So try to figure out exactly what your opponent gains and loses by it. Try to figure out what your next turn is going to be. If you're going to have mana up for a combat trick next turn or a removal spell, then like you have run aground in your hand. Well, if I take 4 this turn, but then next turn I have a combat trick up, like that's pretty good. You're generally going to want to wait to do that. I think in general, people should double block more and be more aggressive about it. I don't know. You've watched me play a lot. I just jam.
Yeah, you do too. You're very much. I think that there's actually a lesson to be learned though from the way that you play that, which is, I think that it's fine. Like people get scared.
Yeah,
they're like, oh, I'm gonna get. It's like it's okay to accept the outcome of I'm gonna double block here, and I might lose both my creatures to a sure strike, and say, well, how does that look for me? Because oftentimes, if you don't have a removal spell in your hand, that sure strike is getting you at some point. It's either going to let their creature, get blocked by one of your bigger creatures and then kill that one, or you're going to lose these 2 smaller creatures. And you can't just say, well, I'll take 4, I'll take 4, I'll take 4. Like that's not going to work either. So a lot of times, even though you're really scared about the outcome of your double block, it's going to happen at some point anyway. And you need to just suck it up and put 2 creatures in front of their creature.
Yeah, just double block more often is kind of the end advice.
Sarah Lynn says, hello, I feel like I undervalue combat tricks and rarely take them. What's a good rule of thumb to evaluate combat tricks playability in a given set? Is it just the speed of the format that matters?
That is mostly what matters.
Mostly what matters, yes.
It's not just the speed of the format, but the faster a format, the better combat tricks tend to be. Mm-hmm. It's also good to know what the rate on the combat tricks are, like how much you're getting.
How good is it, right? I mean,
1 mana for +2/+2 is good. Those combat tricks actually have been good the last couple sets.
Definitely.
2 mana for +3/+3 is average. Like that is not great. And then once you're looking at 3 mana plus combat tricks, they have to do something pretty special because 3 mana is a lot for combat tricks.
That's right. Yeah, and Sarah Lynn, you were on. It is the speed of the format. That is your primary. That is the primary thing that dictates how good the combat tricks are. One thing I will say is that combat tricks of late seem to be pretty close. Like there usually be one bad combat trick, but then a bunch of pretty decent ones, and they're often somewhat interchangeable. So I find that I rarely have to value them super highly in draft because, I mean, how many do I want? Between 1 and 3, maybe. And some decks don't want them at all. Some formats don't want them at all. But in a fast format, don't feel bad. Take them, play them. They're actually very, very good in those low to the ground decks.
The more people are forced to block, the better combat tricks get. The faster the games are, and the more often they come down to races, the better combat tricks get. Yeah. The more good instant speed interaction, the worse they get. Because when there's 2 mana kill a creature, or 3 mana kill a creature, or bounce a creature, you can't really afford to use a combat trick and then get blown out.
Yeah.
So I think the speed of the format's the best rule of thumb. The value, like the rate you're getting for the combat trick, is the second, and from there you can kind of extrapolate like how often you want combat tricks in your deck.
Yeah, cheaper the better. Last question comes from Jean-Luc, who says, once I discover an archetype I like, I tend to overrate these cards in subsequent drafts. For example, black-white vampires in Ixalan. I do that too. Yeah. What would you recommend to avoid this unconscious bias? And this is really good, Jean-Luc, that you're recognizing this, because a lot of people don't. They just keep doing it over and over again. And I'll tell you what I do, because I suffer from this too. I just start taking other cards. Because I will just have this. I mean, have you ever watched a streamer or a video or even a friend draft, and they're drafting a perfectly good deck that seems like in the right colors, yet all they're doing is talking about the cards that they're passing? Oh, there's another great vampire card, and they're like, take a burn spell. You're like, well, okay, yeah, that was a fine vampire card, but that was a really good card for your deck. And then they pass, oh my God, Paladin of the Bloodstain. I can't believe that's still in the pack. You're like, the card's not even that good. Like, there's a good card for you here. You know, they just get hung up on that over and over. I think we're all sort of prone to that a little bit. So I'll just go in the deep. I'm just like, I'm not drafting vampires, you know, unless it's just hitting me over the head and I can't avoid it. And I do that early in the format. Now, the reason I do it is to learn, because I need to get my hands on these different archetypes before I get in the booth at the Pro Tour, at a Grand Prix, and also just for myself. And I will just force myself to do it, because I'll do the same thing. I'll find something that works and I'll just hammer on it, because I figure I can just keep winning with this before people really catch up or whatever.
Yeah, I think that you have to watch out for this bias. It creeps up pretty fast. You know, all of a sudden you're first picking cards because you think they're better, so you end up drafting the same deck over and over again, when realistically you're just forcing that deck. Right. Forcing yourself to not draft that deck is a good way to recalibrate a little bit. Trying to identify cards where your evaluation is off is good, because like if eventually you know about it, you're like, wow, I drafted Black White Vampires 4 of my last 6 drafts. It was not open all of those drafts. Like that's just unlikely.
Yeah. And
you're like, okay, so what am I doing? And you're like, oh, I guess I really think Skymarch Bloodletter is just so good. I'm taking it over Fire Cannon Blast.
Right.
And then just be like, that is wrong. I should not do that.
Yeah, like, and you're kind of in the safety net of the thing that you know, right? Because that's really what's going on here, is that it's scary, because I know this card is good. And if I go take this, you know, this random pirate or whatever that I haven't played with yet, it might suck. I might lose the draft because of it, but I know this card's good. I know how to draft this deck. And the problem is, of course, is that most of us are thinking a little bit longer term, right? We're going to be doing some drafts over the course of the next few months, whether it's Magic Online grinders, you know, just drafting, or whether it's your weekly shop event that you go to. You're still going to draft a set 4, 5, 6 times, even if you're only doing it once a week. So you don't want to draft vampires every single week. You know, the time when it's not open at your table, you're going to have no idea what to do. You're going to be forced into some other archetype, and you won't even have experimented with it at all. Plus, you might find something you like. You might be the first one in your play group or an early person on Magic Online to understand like how Merfolk worked in Ixalan, and you're just smashing people with cards that are slower for people to pick up, you know, the one drops and the one with the wins and stuff like that. And you're just like crushing people because they're still kind of undervaluing those until they, you know, well, until you beat them enough so that they understand.
Yeah, I think that it is easy a trap to fall into, but once you recognize it, you do a pretty good job of stopping it.
Yeah, and you've already done that, Jean-Luc. Yeah.
By recognizing it, you're already most of the way there.
Yeah.
The problem is when you don't recognize it.
Yes, that is the big problem. And Jean-Luc is not suffering from that. So that's going to do it. Thank you so much for all these awesome questions from our patrons. And again, if you want to sign up for the Patreon, you get access to these type of threads where you can throw your question in the ring, and we'll do our best to answer them on the show. And of course, give us feedback and talk to us and all that kind of stuff through the Patreon. And again, I'm really relieved that they fixed that decision that they made, because that was not good. I was pretty unhappy about that. Channelfireball.com. Newsletter. I'm going to put the newsletter sign up link in the show notes for those of you that want to get the apparently now written by Luis Scott-Vargas newsletter. You said you're going to be talking about the deck that you've been playing that week? Yeah,
going to kind of look at like what has been going on that week magic wise.
You going to have fun with it, or is it going to be like news?
No, it's not actual news. You know, it's not fake news either. It's just I'm gonna have fun with it. And this first week was good. I really did like the deck. And sometimes I'll have tech for you, like, you know, what I think is going to be good in this, you know, upcoming week. Sometimes it's going to be as foretold living in with ancestral visions and cryptic commands. You know, I'm not claiming it's going to be always the you know, killer honed decks, but sometimes it will be. So I'm gonna have fun with it. And whatever it is I feel like doing, I'll be doing that.
I'll be honest. I would prefer a high nonsense ratio for these. I can seek out hardcore technology, you know, on the front page of CFB. Yeah. But but you know, getting the daily dose of Luis nonsense, that can be harder to find. So anyway, that, and then of course, while you're at Channel Fireball, you can order Unstable, you can order all types of stuff. And if you want to sell your cards back, this is a really cool thing that you can do. You can send them in. And if you want to trade them in for store credit, so you can get a box of Unstable or some singles or whatever it is that you want, you're going to get 30% back, or bonus, on top of what you would have already gotten for cash. And if you want cash, you can get that too. those cards pile up. Everybody has them. You know, everybody that goes to the local game store and drafts comes home with a pile of cards. And what are you going to do? Make an entire standard deck out of that? Probably not. So sell them back, get more cards, and keep that whole circle of life going at channelfireball.com. If you want to find us on social media, I'm Marshall_LR and Luis is LSV. You can find everything related to the podcast at lrcast.com. Links to all that stuff that we talked about on the show. That is going to do it for the episode this week. Thanks again for everybody who asked questions. We'll be back next week. See you then. All right, Luis, you ready for this?
Oh, yeah.
I'm going to give you an option. Would you like option 1 or option 2?
Option 1.
Okay. So what we're doing, this came from Carell, and Carell gave us 2 packs. So we're doing a Let's Stump Vargas. There's an extra challenge to this Let's Stump Vargas. I am going to be reading you these cards in Spanish.
Okay. I'm in for that.
I do not speak Spanish. So this comes from the set called Discordia.
Okay.
Do you know what that is?
Discordia? No, I don't.
Great. That's perfect. All right. First one. Sello de Fatalidad.
Okay, that's like Seal of Doom.
It is. The problem is I don't actually know these cards.
It's tuna. So, I see. Discordia is like Nemesis, then I think.
Nope. Wait, I don't think so.
In any case, Seal of Doom is tuna black for enchantment. You can sack it to destroy target non-black creature.
I mean, I could just read you the text if that's easier for you. Wow. Eidolon Verde.
This is Green Eidolon.
Is that what it's called?
Yes.
Okay. Sacrificar la Eidolon Verde.
This adds 3 mana to your mana pool.
You mean it agregas 3 mana?
Yes, that's exactly right. This is Dissension. Yes, Discord.
Yes, Dissension. That's what set this is. All right, so what does this card do?
So this is 3 and a green.
No idea.
It's Verdant Eidolon. It's 3 and a green for a 2/2. You can pay a green to sack it to add 3 mana of any color to your mana pool. And when you play a multicolor card, return it from the graveyard to your hand.
Right, 2 for 2. Oh no, this one's really long. How do you say guardian in Spanish? I mean, it's the same word, but how do you pronounce it?
Guardian.
Guardián del Pacto entre Gremios. I know this card.
So this is a 2/3 for 4 with first strike and protection from monocolor, I think.
Oh, it's so close. It doesn't have first strike.
Oh, okay.
Whatever. I'm giving that one to you. You knew what it was. Exploradora a la de Seda. It literally says Exploradora. Or Exploradora. Wow, that artwork is terrible.
This is Explorer of something. I don't really know. It
has Vuela.
So yes, it's flying.
Okay, well, it's a fairy.
Uh-huh. Oh, this is two in a blue for a 2/1 flying.
Yes.
Pay a green to sack it to search for a land and put it into play.
Oh, you got there. Wow. All right. This is Llamas Carcagentes. Carcayentes.
Say it again?
Llamas Carcayentes. Carcayantes. There you go.
Oh my God,
I don't know what that word means. I'm looking that up.
I don't know what you're even saying here.
Carcayantes. What does this mean in Spanish? Laughter.
Oh.
From the word carcayadas, except for that's not the word on the card. Laughing llama?
Laughing llama?
Well, the word is llamas. Isn't that how you spell? Isn't that how you pronounce LLAMAS?
Llama.
Llama carcayante. Yeah, I don't know, man. All right, you didn't get this one right.
No.
I also don't know what card. It's 3 and a red for an instant. It does 3 puntos.
Just
de daño.
De daño.
Yeah.
Oh, this is Cackling Flames.
Cackling. There you go. See? Laughter. Vals Macabro.
This is Macabre Waltz, One in a Black.
Yes. Oh, good one. Very good. Halson del Almenara.
What was it?
Halson de Almenara. It has vuela. My favorite.
I don't know. See, okay, so like to give listeners a little context, I speak Spanish, but not like insanely well. Like I can definitely understand Spanish and I can make myself understood. Magic cards are another layer removed because they use a bunch of weird words.
And then you have the Marshall layer here too.
Yes. And so, because how many...
I do not speak Spanish.
How many times do you run into, as an English speaker or whatever native language you speak, reading cards of that language and not understanding what the words are because you haven't seen these weird words?
Yeah, because they're weird words that don't match. Like they're made up words in Spanish too, right? I don't know. This is 1 and a white for a 1/1 flyer. It's a bird.
Sure.
Whenever halcyon, what does halcyon mean? Halcon?
I mean, halcyon is an English word, but I don't know if that's it. Is this is the one that like untaps something when it hits them?
No, it has white. It gets +0/+1.
Oh, okay.
And when it enters a battlefield, something happens that I don't know.
Sure.
Maybe what does puedes mean?
You may.
Okay. Anyway, whatever. Denegar.
What is that?
Denegar. Denigrate? What does that mean?
I mean, something like that. Yeah, I think.
It's a gold card. This is gas. I don't know what it means. Deny.
Oh. Okay.
Wait, is this I don't know what it is in English. It's blue-white X for an instant.
Oh, overrule.
Overrule.
I'm never going to know that Denegad means overrule.
Yeah, I don't either.
It's blue-white X. They counter a spell unless they pay X and you gain X life, I think.
Yeah, you're not getting that one, buddy. Casa Caballeras de Utvara.
Utvara House Guard. Or House something.
It has vuela.
This is a 1/2 flyer for 2.
Yes.
It has to attack every turn.
Yep, that's it. You got it. Okay, almost done. Plumas de la Paz.
Oh, Plumes of Peace. This is 1 blue-white. Enchant creature doesn't untap, and you can forecast.
This is insane. You're actually getting some of these even through Magic and Spanish and me. You have a lot of... Yeah, you must know this set really well. Llorado Comprometido. Oh, you know this one. It has Defender.
Yeah, it's something like... Say it again?
It's Llorado, which I think means jury or judge.
Oathsworn Jury. This is like 2 and a white, 1/4.
Yes.
Kind of spell.
Yes. You did it. This guy's gas. Husar de la Corte.
Oh, Court Hussar.
Yes. I'm not going to make you read that one because I know you know what it does. Maga, which that's a good hint because I know this one too. Eteria Azoria.
Azoria's Guildmage.
Mm-hmm.
2 mana, 2/2. You can counter activated abilities. Or
no, it's different. It's not that one.
Wait, is this an Azorius Guildmage?
No.
Oh.
You were close though. It is an Azorius colored card.
Oh. Something.
Maga Eteria Azoria. It's 1 blue-white for a 1/1.
1 blue-white for a 1/1?
Yeah, whenever an opponent maybe goes to your hand, you can pay 1 if you do draw a card. Is that a card?
Sure. I don't. Yeah, I guess so. I don't remember what this card is exactly.
I can't remember either. It's Magus or Mage. Something Mage, right? All right, 2 more to go. This one is Drekavac. That is not a real word. I don't know. Drekavac.
Drekavac?
Drekavac.
Drekavac. I don't know what that is.
It's 1 and a black for a 3/3.
Okay.
When it enters the juego, sacrifice... discard a card or something like that. A 2 mana 3/3 in black?
I don't remember this
Or
card.
whatever. Ooh, we got a sweet rare for the giveaway.
Huh?
Fuente Consagrada.
Oh, Hallowed Fountain.
Yeah, we got a hallowed fountain. Very nice. Cool. That'll go right in the thing. Oh, all right. So let's get the final count here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
En Let's Dump Vargas.
you got you got 10 and 5. That's really good.
Casi cinco.
Yeah, not too bad. Okay, say goodbye to everybody in Spanish.
Chao todos que están escuchando a Limited Resources y nos vemos la próxima semana.